All right. So the first thing I would say, I guess, in relation to a podcasting is you have to make sure you have an idea of what you're going to cover, right? So whether that's gaming, whether that's tech, whether that's entertainment, exactly what that looks like for you and your audience, you definitely have to figure that out. Typically, what I notice is when individuals are trying to figure out, how to start a podcast or when to start a podcast, the ideas that they need to have aren't necessarily narrowed down yet. So they're trying to navigate the idea concept of, what to record and how to do that, that kind of a thing. And I think pretty much when you start putting those ideas down on paper, I think it makes it a little bit easier for you on how you want to navigate that particular conversation. So for instance, if I were to, concept a particular show, one of the things that I notice even in the podcasting world is that the title is important, right? Because you can technically SEO the title for the show that you're trying to put together. So definitely consider what is my title going to be? Is it going to be a short title, long title? Short titles really stick with individuals, so that's definitely important. Another thing to consider is, am I going to do the show with somebody, or am I going to do the show by myself? Okay, so that's a pretty interesting concept as well, because if you decide to do the show by yourself, that means the learning curve is going to be by yourself, production, editing, that's going to be by yourself, and everything else that incorporates the grind of putting the show together. Who is going to be the executive producer if you're going to have somebody doing that? Who's going to be the social media person? You got to have somebody for that. Who's going to be the PR, the public relations for the team? You got to have somebody for that. So now, are you going to be the end all be all for all that? Or are you going to find individuals that's going to fit that particular dynamic? So another thing I noticed also in this podcasting space is that a lot of individuals are doing the podcast on YouTube, as well as having a mic, a sound studio type setup, which is pretty interesting because at the same time you'll get the body language stuff that you would normally get on the voice aspect of it, right? So we could do voice inflections for a lot of different things, but that doesn't necessarily mean that those things are actually going to convey some of the things that we want to convey with sound, right? So sound, we could do a lot, especially with the fact that we can have somebody listen to our content and not necessarily have their eyes dedicated to that, right? Which is an interesting thing, because when you think about it, the ability for us to set up a show where thousands of individuals and even millions listen to the platform that we have and the shows that we actually come out with, that's a pretty powerful thing. You don't necessarily have to be an NPR type of person or anything like that, but you can have a platform where you can collect your thoughts, create a show, right? Get your show notes together, and then, make that concept come to life, which is pretty simple and pretty powerful when you think about it. So the other thing too I noticed is a lot of concepts, a lot of companies who had, let's say, magazines out, or who still have magazines out, they'll create a podcast around that, which is pretty cool, right? So when you think of the recent addition to the podcasting world is Nintendo Power, right? So Nintendo Power now, what used to be a great magazine, which was retired a few years back, right, give or take. Now Nintendo Power is in the form of a podcast, because that conversation can still be packed into things that we can consume, right? So as far as consumption is concerned, like the three main form of consumption would include written, right, a video, and a spoken word, right? So if you can capture those three things and in a particular format, I think you'd be in good shape. So if you're a writer, you want to write books, you want to write blogs, you want to do all those things, that's great. You can capture an audience that will spend time reading, but there's an audience that may not be spending their time reading anything, right? So you want to figure out, how exactly am I going to have these individuals read my things if they don't read blogs, right? So the way you can kind of fix that, if you want to say that, and in a sense, you can actually read your post and make them short audio posts, right? Audio blog posts. You can do that. If you don't want to do that, but you have a very high interest in video content, then what you can do is read that in front of a camera and have a conversation about the thoughts that you were having when you created the piece that you had that was originally just a written piece, right? So you have the written piece, you have the video piece, you have the audio piece, and if you can find a way to incorporate those things into the things that you're doing for your personal brand, or let's say you're working as a podcast producer for a particular company and have a particular idea of how they want to do storytelling and all those different things, you can incorporate those lessons into creating your own platform. So the focus really, when I'm having this conversation or when I'm having this soliloquy, if you will, is to consider creating your own content, because you have the opportunity to do it. And a lot of individuals feel they need permission to do that. I'm not good enough. I haven't, gone to journalism school. I haven't done anything that would qualify me to create content where individuals would listen. So what's happening there is you're actually setting yourself up to not create something awesome that somebody can benefit from, right? So if you think about the concept of you have a personality that, let's say, I do not, right? Obviously, right? Because we're two different individuals. So what happens with that is you'll be able to reach individuals that I would probably never reach, right? It could be anything. It could be a demographic thing. It could be where I'm from. It could be how I speak or whatever it is. But you can actually reach individuals that I'll probably never reach, right? And I think making that a motivation to start an actual podcast is a powerful thing, right? So I think that the concept of ideas, getting to a place to say, yeah, my voice matters to create content for the world is very, very important. So I think I would start there. So the next thing I would do also is get into a habit of writing things down, right? Write it down. So you have an idea, write it down. So the first thing I would do is I would take a piece of paper and a pen, and then I would write your name, put a circle around that, and then branch that off into different circles of the interest that you have. So if you do that, you'll be able to brainstorm, okay, so this is me in the center, the centerpiece of it all, and these are the things that I like, right? So it could be, as I was saying before, video games, entertainment, tech, science stuff, STEM stuff, educational stuff, right? You pick a particular niche that is of interest to you, and then build off of that. Okay, so what does your team look like? As we were talking about teams before, is it something that you want to consider? As far as the tools, what kind of tools are you looking to do to use, right? Are you going to try free tools first, or are you going to go all in and buy like a special premium studio package of, that kind of a thing? So what kind of mics are you going to use? What, all those things, initially, you have to make those decisions depending on how you want to start, right? I like the approach of not necessarily spending a whole bunch of cash up front, right? And what I mean by that is, if you can find tools that work and you master those tools and then you decide to buy stuff later, I like that approach, because at least you're going in with a very, very low investment in terms of financial is concerned, right? You master the tools that are available to you, And then from there, you build off of that. Because what happens is individuals feel like you need to buy expensive equipment, and the expensive equipment make you a better podcaster or a better content creator, right? I don't follow that philosophy, how exactly that works. Okay, just because I have a more expensive car, let's say, doesn't make me a better driver. Okay, so if I have an expensive car, but I'm a novice at driving a manual transmission, it doesn't matter how expensive the car is. But yet somebody who may not necessarily have an expensive car, but they're intermediate to expert level as far as driving a manual transmission, that's a whole nother thing. So I think the tools that you consider to get up front, I would always use let's not spend so much, but there are tools that are great budget tools that can get you, some solid results. So I think that the idea of focusing around what exactly you're going to use in the beginning is extremely important, right? So you don't have to go all out and buy like a boom arm or, a very, very expensive mic and all these different equipment, all this 4K stuff, which if you have the money you want to spend, and the other conversation surrounding that is if you have the money that you want to spend, that's great. Definitely consider spending it. But I don't think that it's a necessity up front, right? If that makes any sense. So the other thing I want to address is competition. I don't really consider podcasting competition, right? So I don't really think it's a competition thing. So when I think about it, I really want to make sure that I'm putting out the best product that I can. So in doing that, I think that once you consider putting out the best product that you can, you are building cadence to be better over time. So as you build cadence over time, then you get better at the process of creating content, right? And I think that's where you need to be in terms of the process itself. So I think that according to the stat, if you do 7 podcast episodes, right, and you make it to 8, you've actually achieved more than most individuals who are actually coming out creating content when it comes to podcasting. So the thing is, just create 1 episode at a time and you should be fine. So don't focus on the overwhelming number of individuals who have way more shows than you or anything like that. Just create the content that you can create, and then it'll just come naturally. So a couple of things in relation to how to create the content, right? How to organize yourself to create the content. So what I do as far as that's concerned is we usually record on Sundays when we record, right? We're kind of on a little hiatus right now because of the holiday season or whatever. But what I do is I record, I start thinking about the things that I'm going to record based on the notes that I already took for next week. So let's say if we record this Sunday, okay, right after we record that particular episode on that Sunday, I'm already thinking about next Sunday's episode 7 days out, right? Because we usually record on Sundays. So what I'll do is I'll say, okay, these are the notes that we have for this upcoming Sunday, and I gather all those notes all week until Friday, Saturday, start putting all the information together. But the thing that's interesting about that is as I'm putting the notes together, I read maybe the headlines and a couple of sentences into that particular article for whatever that news bit is for that week. And then, I start brewing on it, right? I start thinking about it, what kind of thoughts that I want to have about it, what particular angle I want to address. So day 1, I'm already thinking about those things midweek, Wednesday for that week, I kind of have an idea of how I want to address the things that I want to address. So day 6, getting into or preparing for production day, I already have a gist of how I want the conversation to go, right? Or even how I want to address the conversation, even with my inquiries to my co-host, right? So all those things are set up, not necessarily the day of, not the day that we're recording. We're actually setting up all that information 6 days ahead of time. That may seem like it's extreme, but if you're looking for a not popular, if you're looking for a great production, preparation sets you up for a great production, right? So if you think of the news anchors that or the shows that you like to watch, preparation makes that show pretty good. Even if they go off of tangents, then everything that they've prepared for the show allow the individuals to easily go off tangent and come back because they're prepared. So now the other thing with that is when the show is not prepared, you kind of know. So it's almost like if you're not prepared and you just decide to just come on the microphone and have a conversation, then are you wasting the listener's time? Right? Because I could be listening to something that could be adding value to me, but instead I turn on your show and your show doesn't sound like it was preparing me to have value added to my life before I stopped and moved to another podcast, right? So it's very critical that when you're creating content, at least have, 6 to 8 bullet points of some information that you have prepared, so that way you're not wasting anybody's time when they listen to your content. So typically, going back to, I guess, the preparation of it, right? I usually have about 8 to 28 bullet points prepared for every single podcast. Typically, the lowest we'll ever have is probably 12 to 15 bullet points of articles or different things that we feel, even if we spend 2 to 3 seconds on it, just mentioning it and moving on to the next thing, we still have that information available for the individuals who are going to be listening to that particular episode. So let's take one episode that was recently recorded, right? I think the last episode we recorded, if you want to call it the last episode we kind of recorded for 2017, I think that episode was from start to finish 2 hours and 31 minutes, give or take, something like that. Solid 2 hours and 31 minutes, no fluff, no random things that didn't make sense, right? None of that stuff. So you went from start of the episode, solid content, all the way to the first hour, solid content to the second hour, and the preparation of the episode itself sparked a question answer portion, which was half an hour that we didn't plan for, right? Because the individuals in the chat wanted us to share more information about ourselves before we closed out that episode. We didn't plan for that. I planned for all the bullet points that I planned for that particular episode. Nothing more, nothing less. But because the content, I guess, rolled out the way it did and it was good, we ended up adding another half an hour plus at the tail end of that, of just heart-to-heart question answer from our community. So that whole piece was really powerful for me, just thinking about it, even reflecting on it now, based on that, how it took place. I really enjoyed that. So you have that. So content creation, preparation can make tangents absolutely incredible, right? And as you do that, it's going to make the content even better to consume, And when the individuals consume the content, they'll feel like they came to a place where you're going to add value to them. And as you add the value to them, they're going to appreciate that and they're going to come back. So why do people listen to a particular podcast or a particular host? I don't know. Could be personality, could be the jokes, could be the wit, could be the entertainment of that particular co-host, guest host, producer, editor, whoever it is. There's just something that you like about their personality that makes you want to come back, right? That kind of a thing, which is great. But why do people listen? Why do they even pay attention? Why do they download again? That kind of a thing. I believe that they listen because they came for the content first, and then they stayed for you. Whatever you're offering as an individual, they appreciated what you're offering as an individual, and they decided to stay. And I think that's a great thing. Now, one of the things that I was doing, one of the big mistakes, if I want to call it a big mistake, which I think it was a big mistake, it's great to listen to the individuals that you enjoy listening to. That's fantastic. But try your best not to emulate them to the point that you almost sound like them, right? Or you behave like them. Your mannerisms are like them. That could get really interesting when you emulate or you want to be like somebody. To like that, when you're that far gone, I think you have to reel it back, right? In terms of how much content you're consuming from those individuals. Now this is my personal practice. I don't necessarily. This is not everybody's practice, but this is my practice. Okay. And this is what I mean. So when I'm getting ready to record a podcast episode, whatever the podcast episode is, because there's so many individuals in the video games, content creation, podcasting arena, or whatever, right? Where I have a good portion of individuals that I call friends, and even, brothers and sisters, if you will, in the podcasting community. What I do not do is listen to their podcast before I record mine. Because what happens is, although I've trained myself to use the shopping cart method when I'm listening to people's content, there's still that urge for me to reference the information that I heard from their podcast into my podcast, right? So the danger in that is, for me, it takes away from my individuality as a content creator. Okay? So, and I don't want my personality and the way I create content to get diluted in the process of all the different shows that I'm listening to that are tech, gaming, and entertainment related. I just don't want that to happen. So the only way for me to solve that challenge, if you will, because, I love listening to other content. I love supporting and hearing their point of view of whatever that thing is at the time, whatever episode is, whatever, they're saying about a particular game, a particular title, a particular console, or whatever the case might be. Although I want to hear that, I don't want to hear it before I record my show, right? So I think that it's essential as you create content, especially if you're in the early stages of creating the content, that you decide to unplug from the individuals that you're a fan of or you look up to or stuff like that, and focus on creating your content. And if perchance it's that much of an interest for you to go back and listen to that episode that they put out on Monday, Tuesday, or Wednesday, or whatever it is, then, feel free to do that. But I I can't do that. I guess I'm at a stage now where I don't want anything to hinder someone, listening, partaking of the content that we put out, because I want them to share what we love and our personality and the way we create content. I don't want that experience to be ruined for the listener that's about to listen to the content that I'm putting out. So if there's a particular podcast or a particular website or a particular blog that's going to put out an episode that sounds similar to what we're getting ready to put out because of the headline, and I know that most of the stuff that is being talked about in that particular episode I'm going to talk about on my episode, then I'm not listening to that episode until I publish and put it out on the social media and all those things. That's after that, maybe I'll jump in, dip in, and that kind of a thing, and then go from there. So I think that's been essential for me to set apart the way I create content from one group to another. So we could, just by way of news, as I mentioned earlier, the Nintendo Power information came out, right? So I'm not necessarily going to talk about that. I don't know, maybe not, because we're rolling into the holiday season, right? So I don't think I'm necessarily going to talk about that. I'll probably mention it in an upcoming episode that they're doing that, which is fantastic. I kind of mentioned it here, but outside of that, I don't know if I'm going to mention it again. But it is what it is. But I like the fact that the opportunity to create content is there for anybody, big corporation, small corporation, small business owner, right? Small streamer, huge streamer, whatever. So that particular aspect and desire and availability to create content is there. So that's that. So let's talk about equipment for a little bit, real quick. So I use a standard mic. I call it a standard mic. It's an ATR 2100. It has a boom arm, and it's a USB and XLR mic. Very simple. It goes on sale quite often, so you can get it anywhere between $59 and $80, right? And it grows with your studio. So you have the USB capability. If you don't have all the XLR stuff yet, you can plug it into an audio box kind of equipment. You can do that for the XLR portion later on. You can get 1 or 2 or 3 of them and get a audio box that supports 3 or 4 XLRs and create a local podcast with your friends if you're thinking about that. Then from there you decide to shoot it. You point a camera in that direction. Make sure the camera has a mic on it, a more desirable mic in relation to the sound, so it picks up what it needs to pick up. Or you can sync the audio that you're recording locally with the microphones if that's the thing that you're doing, and then sync it with the podcast, the video portion, and then put that out, right? So as far as podcast days and when to actually put out the podcast itself, that's a conversational thing. A lot of individuals say, hey, I want to put out the podcast on this day. I want to put out the podcast on that day. Now, the time frame will be different depending on if you're domestic, if you're international. It depends on where you want to put that out, right? So for me, for us, we record the podcast on Sundays, right, on Twitch. And then after we finish the Twitch stuff, I do an export highlight to YouTube, right? You can schedule that or do that right away. Typically, if you want that to go up at a desirable time where most shows are taking place, then I would say drop it anywhere between 9 a.m. and maybe 12 p.m. on a Monday, right? If you don't drop it on a Monday, try to drop it on a Wednesday. If you don't drop it on a Wednesday, I would say do a Thursday, and that would be your cutoff, right? Because anything after that, you're going into the weekend. It's a different vibe going into the weekend when your podcast drops. but what I've seen in terms of the podcasts I listen to, the popular podcasts that I listen to, they drop on Mondays or Tuesdays or Thursdays. Those are the days, right? So if you're deciding to drop a podcast, I would consider dropping either Sunday into Monday, early Monday morning, like 3 a.m., right? Publish the stuff that's going to be on the socials between 9 and 11:30 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, right? If you're dropping a show on a Thursday, allow it to hit the feed as early as possible, because most of the software, the audio upload software, allows you can schedule it in advance to hit the feeds right away. So if you want to do like a 3 a.m. drop in the feeds and then do the publishing later, you can do that. Or if you could do the 3 a.m. drop in the feeds and then do a scheduling for the post about 10:30, 11, or between 10:30 and 11:30, that day or whatever, that kind of a thing. So you play around with it, because what you'll see is that there's different individuals doing different things on different days, obviously, right? That's just the world that we live in. So if a Monday drop is reasonable for you, do that. If it's not, midweek is better, do that. I would cut off by Thursday. If you don't do by Thursday, I would drop it Sunday into Monday. That's how I would do that. Okay, so yeah, the content, what do you like? What interests you, right? What do you like talking about? What speaks to your DNA? What's the rotation of that? Do you want to do a seasonal thing, or do you want to do something that is an episodic thing? What kind of content do you want to create? So you have to decide what you want to do with that. How often are you going to release? What's the frequency? Is it going to be once a month? Is it going to be, every week? Is it going to be every other week? Right? So even the consistency in that is interesting too, because are you going to release the content for people to, are they going to expect you to drop a episode every week? Because if they're going to expect the episode every week and you don't drop it, then you may lose them as a listener, right? So you have to make sure that you're mindful of even the dropping of the episode, when you drop the episode, weekly, bi-weekly, monthly, that kind of a thing. So that's important too. So yeah, but the content is very important. Do you want the show to be friendly to parents, right? Is it going to be a family friendly show, or is it going to be a show where you're going to drop, explicit words on it, that kind of a thing? What kind of show are you formatting? I think these are the questions that I wish that was brought to my attention early on, because early on the only thing I wanted to do was just have a conversation about the things that I wanted to talk about, which was gaming, right? And still want to talk about those things, how it's changed, and even the news that's coming out. Currently in the news is the PUBG thing, the 1.0 update. People are talking about that. And then you also have the Destiny 2 stuff with Zer being in town. I don't know what he has or what he dropped. That's a conversation. You can talk about that. And just the Bayonetta conversation with Nintendo dropping exclusive Bayonetta 3, that conversation about that. There's so many different things you could talk about. I'm paying attention to it. That's what I like to talk about. I like to talk about the gaming stuff. Sony's doing well with how many consoles is selling, that thing. Nintendo's doing well. They just did 10 million, that thing. So there's so many different conversations we could have around gaming, or we can niche it down to specific conversational debates. With a particular co-host leaving a show that they created. You can have a conversation around that. That's always an interesting conversation. Individuals who feel like because they're famous and they should have certain privileges, even though those privileges go against rules and regulations, which makes no sense to me. But we can have a conversation about that. So different things that you can bring into your sphere and talk about it, and not feel like you have to censor yourself to some degree when you're having that conversation, and get the point out with your personality, right? Which is an amazing thing. And people will consume that content whenever you decide to drop it, and it's going to either spark a great conversation, it could spark a great argument, it could be a whole bunch of things surrounding that kind of a thing. All right, so how I guess the question I'm thinking about is being in it for the long haul, right? Because podcasting is not for the sprinter. Okay, it's not for the sprinter. I was a sprinter, okay, in terms of my mindset approaching the podcasting platform. There are many times where I wanted to sprint and stop, right? But podcasting is not for the individual who just wants to come in, create a few shows, podcast episodes, to be pretty clear with that, and feel like their whole thing is just going to take off. Everybody's going to know their name, that kind of a thing. It doesn't work that way. Okay, so even today, it still feels like I'm starting out, even though I have a catalog that's over 300 episodes, which is weird saying that. I still feel like next episode feels like my first episode. I've learned more. I know more now than I did when I started out, but it feels like I'm grinding it and it's a new feeling, right? It's like, man, this is a brand new show. What are we going to do this time? What changes are we going to make? How are we going to do the intro, outro? What's that going to look like? And even editing, as I'm thinking about it, we can talk about editing real quick, is editing is interesting, right? Editing, you're painting a picture for the individuals who are going to listen to your content. And to me, that's what editing is. You're painting a picture for the individuals that will be listening to your content. And I didn't like editing at first. I just didn't like it. But now, editing is everything, right? I was listening to a particular host, and she said that it doesn't matter what you do when the thing is being recorded. The individual who has the true power is the individual that handles the files in post-production. Because you could say one thing while it was going on, and if no one saw while it was going on, but they see all the stuff post-production, they're the ones that could really influence your thought process and even how you see a particular image or video or listen to a particular audio file post-production, right? So I had a pretty good grasp on how I wanted to navigate my post-production the second half of 2017. I had an idea, I had some thoughts. I had my brush, and I was ready to paint the picture I wanted to paint for the show, and how I wanted that production to be when I was releasing the content. And I believe it was successful. And the conversation I really wanted surrounding that was camaraderie between my co-host and I. So post-production, you can do that. You're in control of that, especially if you're the one editing the stuff, right? I didn't cut out a lot when I created the episodes. I really focused on making sure that everything that we talked about was in there, right? The ums and ahs, you can limit those if you're consciously aware of the conversation that you're having, right? So instead of saying or ah, just take a pause, think about it, and then continue the conversation. And I think that is going to make, if you're not the editor, that's going to make the conversation easier to edit for the individual that's actually doing the post-production work. Because if it's a silent pause instead of you're filling a gap with filler words, then that's going to make it a longer editing process for the person that's doing the post-production work for that particular podcast. So I think that when you're actively participating in the things that you're saying, that you don't necessarily have to really spend that much time using filler words to add to that conversation. And everyone does it, right? I'm sure I've done it in this conversation here. But thinking about it is much easier than to add the filler words for that particular conversation. So the point is, in the post-production process of the show, what I wanted to do was make sure that you can feel the energy of the camaraderie and the conversation that I was having with my co-host. And I had to find a way to make sure that that found its way in the podcast, even in the intro sometimes, and sometimes even in the outro, right? And you can't really fool, as great as you can be as an editor, post-production person, or whatever. You can't really fool anybody if they have an issue with you on the show, video or audio. And that's the other thing too. Chemistry is really, really important. And I just said just now. Chemistry is really important. And you have to make sure that whatever issues that you have, challenges that you have, make sure it doesn't come on the actual podcast episode or video production that you're putting out. Because the individuals that is going to be listening to that, they're going to feel that. And they're going to wonder, hey, what's really going on with, so how come they're, seems like they're having a problem. And so people start asking questions about, hey, what happened? Hey, everything cool? So conversation on Twitter starts going off, and people start asking if there's an issue with, this person and that person. And in order to eliminate all those things, you have to have the conversations that you need to have as soon as possible with your co-host, so it doesn't end up on the actual show itself, right? So that's really important. So chemistry is important. Conversations important. You can have disagreements on your platform, your podcast, or whatever you're recording, but you still have to be respectful to the individuals who are making their point on the show. If you are the founder, editor-in-chief, or whatever you want to call yourself, big boss person of that particular platform or whatever, that doesn't make your opinion more highly, more elevated than the individual that is co-hosting with you or part of your team. So that's important too. So even those conversations are very extremely important as you're navigating the creation of the podcast. So there's this thing in podcast world called pod fading. Pod fading is when you start and you, for a while, you record, and then you start slowing down, and then you slow down to the point where you put once in a while episode, and you really, really slow down, and then we don't see you anymore. That's the pod fading, right? You just fade out. And people wonder why people fade, why they don't fade. That's dicey, right? That's a very interesting situation. Expectations can make you fade, right? Make your pod fade. You're looking for something more at your level than should be there, right? Whatever that level is and what your expectations are at the time at that level, that can make you pod fade. You're not growing fast enough, whatever that means, and your, conclusion based on the things that you're seeing. So you think about that. That's an interesting conversation as well. You're comparing what you're seeing, and you believe that should be you right now, when you've only been around for 10 episodes, 20 episodes, or a handful. You're wondering why people are as polished or as distinguished or as thoughtful, as provocative as they can be on their platform, and you're wondering why that's not you when you just started 3-4 weeks ago. Expectations can make somebody pod fade extremely quickly, like extremely quickly. So that's an interesting thing. So I think the best way to, I guess, go about it is to focus on your product. Really, I think if you focus on your product and you're not necessarily worried about what everybody else is doing, you're way ahead of the game. If you understand that podcasting is for the marathon runner and not the sprinter, then you're way ahead of the game in terms of the conversation. So starting is one of the best things that people can do, even with the platform, because the thing is, people will say, well, you know what, I don't know if I should start now. I don't know if I should, put it out right away. I don't know if my team is ready. You'd be surprised, like, who's really ready and who has it in their DNA to just get on the mic and rock it out. People will surprise you. And there'll be disappointments along the way too, depending on the situation. But people will surprise you of how much they have in their DNA, for things like that. Broadcasting stuff, talking about their opinions, sharing how much they value something, or people will really, really surprise you in relation to that conversation. Now, one of I love the underdog narrative, right? I love the underdog narrative, and I like when I see individuals flourish when people don't believe that they should or they have the capability to. I think that's always interesting. So when I think of the individuals in sports, the sports figures, or the individuals who people didn't believe that they can make it, and they flourish and they shine, right? They rise up like a phoenix and take over the world. I always like seeing the underdog narratives when it comes to even like the hip hop artists and those individuals where people count them out before they even walk in the door, right? And I think that this feels to me, even at 300 plus episodes, that there are individuals out there who are the underdogs that people count out. Maybe every time they put out something, they count them out, right? And that's okay. That's okay, because the individuals that you're counting out, they're growing when you're not watching because you counted them out. And I think that it's an encouragement for the individuals who have been podcasting for a while, who feel like they're not necessarily being raised up, on a banner. I guess with some individuals, they feel like they should be next to that kind of a thing, which I don't think that you should compare yourself to anybody with whatever you're doing, whether you're doing a podcast or Twitch stuff or YouTube, or you don't know what it takes for the individuals to put out the content that they put out. You don't know what place that's coming from, right? People take the word hustle and they throw it around a lot, some in good context, some in questionable context, but you don't know what people are going through just to put out the content that they put out. It may seem like a simple thing to put out an hour episode or an hour and a half episode of a podcast, but the production that actually goes with it, especially if you consider production to be somewhat halfway decent, then there's a lot that really goes behind that, especially if it's a small team, anywhere between 3 to 5 people, right? If it's a small team, then, and they're putting out some dope content, that means you have 3 to 5 individuals who are doubling up in skill set or talents that they may have, right? One is the engineer and the audio guy, right? Engineer for both the video stuff, And right, so you have that. Then you have one that could be the social media person and the public relations. So it's really an interesting thing as you see what people are doing with small teams. And in terms of the way that they're able to pivot is amazing too, when you watch as things are rolling out in the tech, and even now with all the things that are happening in the voice enabled world that we live in, all the things that are coming out, and people are able to pivot the things that they're doing in their particular organization to map and use the tech that are available to them. I think that's an amazing thing. So these are some of the thoughts that I have for podcasting and some of the things that I'm seeing right now in the space. So I always like talking about it, sharing information about it. I think it's an amazing platform. I think that you can start with just a mic and a laptop and you're good to go, right? If we were to talk about software, Audacity is underrated for what it can do, and it's an amazing piece of software that you get for free and you could do so much with. So that's another thing that's amazing too. So it's definitely a great time to put out amazing content. Also, you have YouTube, which is a great resource for tutorials and different things like that, especially if the software that you're using you're not necessarily familiar with. But there's so much content out there for YouTube, and the educational arm, if you will, of the things that awaits you, which is great too. So that's it. So I just wanted to share a couple of things in relation to podcasting and stuff like that. Definitely, you can check us out at theshowradio.info, and that's where we post most of our content. And that's it. And we'll see you next time. Peace.